Welcome to the 1600 Sessions, a podcast presented by the White House Historical Association. In each episode, White House Historical Association President Stuart McLaurin interviews luminaries, historians, and eyewitnesses to history about America's most famous residence and office, the White House. We open the doors to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, because it's not only the president's house, it's the people's house. In 1963, First Lady Jackie Kennedy helped arrange one of the most daring art exhibits in history. She charmed the French government into loaning her the Mona Lisa as part of her mission to share the arts with the American people.
Well, art authorities around the world reacted in horror to the idea of transporting a fragile painting from the 16th century all the way across the Atlantic Ocean to Washington, D.C. They considered it an act of American hubris that would cause tremendous damage to the masterpiece. Well, it really was a mission impossible, like out of a Tom Clancy novel, to get the painting safely here. Mona Lisa, imagine, was the First Lady of the world, but Jacqueline Kennedy was First Lady of the nation.
Stuart McLaurin talks to author Margaret Leslie Davis about this fascinating episode of Mona Mania that gripped the country, and why it's been largely forgotten today.
Welcome to the 1600 Sessions. I'm Stuart McLaurin, president of the White House Historical Association, and our association has been doing quite a bit of work recently, focusing on the French influence on the White House. Last spring, we had a symposium on that important influence, and actually, later this spring, the White House will host the French state visit to the United States, a very important time in any White House's history. So I'm pleased today to welcome author and our very good friend, Margaret Leslie Davis, to the podcast, where we're going to delve into a few other French things today. And she's such a good friend, we actually call her Marnie. And she's joining us by phone today to talk about her fascinating book about a very special moment in White House history. And this book actually reveals a largely unknown episode from the Kennedy years in the White House that linked two iconic women. Now, hang with me here. One from the 20th century and one actually from the 16th century. First Lady Jackie Kennedy and Mona Lisa. Marnie's book, Mona Lisa in Camelot, is being published this month by the White House Historical Association, and we're delighted to have her to talk about it today. You can go ahead and order your copy of this book or several copies through our website, whitehousehistory.org. Welcome, Marnie.
Thank you for having me.
Well, your wonderful book tells the story of how First Lady Jackie Kennedy helped bring the most famous painting in the world, the Mona Lisa, to America for 88 days. It's been called the most daring and riskiest art exhibit ever mounted when Mona Lisa traveled to New York and Washington, D.C., immediately following the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was a very stressful time in the world, certainly here in the United States and in Washington. During that time, nearly 2 million Americans saw this masterpiece, and it ignited what many referred to as Mona Mania throughout the country. Marnie, how did you first learn about this wonderfully compelling story from White House history, and what prompted you to write about it?
I had the distinct pleasure to write the definitive biography of the chairman of the National Gallery of Art, a man named Franklin Murphy, who's really known in the West as sort of the culture broker who instilled sort of a consciousness awakening in the arts in the West. And I was going through his correspondence in the archives in Washington, D.C. at the National Gallery, and I happened to stumble on a series of letters. They were tiny, small letters written on blue paper with the famous White House logo at the top, and I realized that they were written by First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy. And as I dug into the letters, she was arguing with then National Gallery Director John Walker about an art exhibition. And I was so intrigued, I kept reading and trying to find out what they were talking about, because not in a single line was the mention of the name of the painting or the exhibition that they were talking about. So as fate would have it, I jumped on an airplane, flew up to the Kennedy Library in Boston,
Yes.
and discovered, to my delight, that the exhibition that they were arguing about so passionately was none other than the 1963 exhibition of the Mona Lisa. And then that launched a 5-year quest to find every primary material I could and put together the story, which I had not known about.
Well, I think so many people in America still don't know about that. And this wonderful book is going to, we hope, share that story across the country. So you delved into this correspondence between John Walker and Jackie Kennedy. He clearly was an important ally to her in this project and promoting the arts in general. So tell us a little bit about their relationship and what you discovered.
Well, John Walker had known Jackie Kennedy from the time she was a young girl, and he took some degree of credit for guiding her interest in art. Jackie's mother would take her on trips to Washington, D.C., and on visits to the National Gallery. John Walker himself would give the family a private tour of the artworks in the gallery. He was Harvard educated, he was tall, handsome, patrician, elegant man, and he was absolutely devoted to the prestige and standing of the National Gallery. And prior to the First Lady's arrival, John Walker, had always tried to protect art from the White House decorators, which I find so fascinating. And once Jackie Kennedy became First Lady, the role was flipped, and he found himself being brought into her circle and into her desire to reawaken the arts and bring new pieces of art from the National Gallery holdings into the White House. One of the most interesting details is that John Walker really aided her in sort of thinking through her redesigns of the green room and that she restored. And also he contributed to her new guidebook for the White House, which was the beginning of the White House Historical Association.
How did, Marnie, how did Mrs. Kennedy first get that idea to bring the Mona Lisa to America? How did this come to mind for her?
Well, one thing is for sure, Mrs. Kennedy took the role of the First Lady beyond the traditional boundaries, and she was quite simply on fire with ideas and plans for the cultural arts in the White House. She saw that the role of the President of the United States was the most celebrated and documented relationship with the American people. And she really set out to make the White House an important place for both beauty and history. She was also deeply attuned to the power of symbols. So she distinctly saw, and President Kennedy was very much in alignment with this view, that the arts were not, a diversion or shall we say, an amusement in the life of a nation's people, but really a critical component of a nation's higher purpose. And this is one of the great things that I admire about her efforts here and why the story of the Mona Lisa coming to America plays such a fun and critical historical role. So in the famous 1961 trip to Paris, where the French people welcomed the First Lady and the President with throngs of enthusiastic crowds, Jackie Kennedy met one of her mentors, one of the people of the world she admired, the French cultural minister, a man by the name of André Malraux, and he gave her tours of the Louvre and of the other various famous galleries in Paris. They really hit it off. They shared many lanes and commons and had an acute understanding of the history of art and the role that artists play. And this is an absolutely true story and documented in the records. At the end of the tour, Mrs. Kennedy said to Malraux how much she enjoyed it and she would love if the French people, through Minister Malraux and President de Gaulle, might lend a few of France's great revered treasures to the American people.
So there was a famous state dinner conversation, I believe, that some whispering took place. Tell us about that.
This was great. This was May 11th, 1962, when Cultural Minister Malraux came to see Mrs. Kennedy, kind of a return thank you for the great trip to France. And she had worked for months planning the evening. She invited the very best of America's great artists, writers, intellectuals. She even enlisted Arthur Schlesinger to write a toast for the president to offer during the elaborate dinner for Malraux. Well, she insisted that her mentor, the cultural minister Malraux, be entertained by America's best talent. And she literally cajoled herself, the virtuoso violinist Isaac Stern, to entertain the assembled guests. And that was just the top of the list. I mean, the list was quite remarkable. It included Thornton Wilder, Rothko, George Balanchine, playwright Tennessee Williams, author Saul Bellow, and of course, America's most celebrated couple at the time, the Lindberghs. It was a night for America to shine.
Spectacular.
This was quite an evening, and she wore a strapless Dupont Shantung designed by Christian Dior in a shade of warm pink. And the pictures of that night are really quite remarkable, and you'll have to take a look at them in the book.
Well, I understand there is one picture in particular that captures the moment when Malraux whispers something to Mrs. Kennedy. And what was that?
This is my favorite picture, and I'm so glad this was recorded on film for posterity. So Jackie was seated for the evening's entertainment, and she was seated directly next to Malraux. She's smiling. Her right shoulder is kind of tucked under his arm as they share kind of a quiet whisper. And Malraux leans toward her ear and whispers something between them. And we learned later that he said to her that he would loan her the Mona Lisa as a tribute to her and Kennedy. It's an absolutely true story, and these two conspirators then launched a great desire to bring the Mona Lisa to America, sort of a mission impossible.
But it was not so easy, was it? Malraux had to convince the very formidable Charles de Gaulle and even the people of France that this was a good idea. So there was cultural diplomacy all of a sudden at play between a cultural affairs minister, Malraux, and this wonderful, brilliant, talented First Lady of the United States, Jacqueline Kennedy. Now, most people think of Mrs. Kennedy for style, but this is a real moment of substance for our countries where she undertook something really made a difference in the mutual dynamic between the United States and France. But tell us about that heavy lifting that got us from that whisper to the Mona Lisa coming to the United States.
Well, art authorities around the world reacted in horror to the idea of transporting a fragile painting from the 16th century all the way across the Atlantic Ocean to Washington, D.C. They considered it an act of American hubris that would cause tremendous damage to the masterpiece. And consider now, this is a painting not on canvas, but painted on poplar wood, and it had already begun to warp. Some said it was starting to look like a buckled bicycle wheel. You know, it had been attacked by insects. It had been hidden in the war. It had been attacked by a maniac criminal in the Louvre. It had had quite its own history, and they thought the painting was too fragile, too important. One of the greatest artifacts of human civilization should not be packed and brought to Washington. Well, Charles de Gaulle was convinced by Jackie and Minister Malraux that it was feasible. They could provide the security and the proper precautions to get the painting to America safely. And at the same time, Stuart, this is so interesting, this was exactly during the moment of the great conflict between France and America over de Gaulle's desire to have a nuclear arsenal. So both parties saw this as a moment of diplomacy, a moment of amity, a moment of goodwill in which both nations could come together for a higher purpose to serve humanity. And both saw their own interests served through an exhibition of this purpose. However, the French people, some of them, reacted in horror at the idea as well. And there were riots in the streets of Paris when it was announced. And the newspaper accounts reflect some of the violence that occurred in the streets outside of the Louvre, protesting the planned exhibition. The protests became so loud and upsetting that President de Gaulle did indeed impose a Mona Lisa blackout with the newspapers to kind of quell emotions and calm things down. And at the Louvre, the head of the laboratory, a really fascinating woman named Madeleine Auwers, was charged with figuring out how to pack the painting and get it safely to America.
Well, we have Mrs. Kennedy's good friend at the National Gallery, John Walker, and he wasn't so fond of the idea either, even threatening to resign, I understand.
That's right. He was not only shocked, he was aghast at the idea of moving a fragile 450-year-old masterpiece, one of the greatest paintings of all time, across the ocean. And he was hard-pressed for ways to let Jackie know that he would refuse to accept the responsibility. And it really was a test of wills of their decades-old friendship. And that was what so much of the letters that I first discovered were about, where he was imploring her not to do it. It was too risky. It would damage the presidency. Harm would come to the painting. It would cause an irreparable rift between the French and American people. And for John Walker, a conservative, devoted man of the National Gallery, the whole scheme reeked of American arrogance, and he urged the First Lady to just abandon the idea. Well, to John Walker's surprise, instead of reacting with apprehension, Jackie responded with mild amusement. This is what we love about her. She said there were hazards, this was true, but the risks were exaggerated. To prove her point, she reminded John Walker that Malraux had determined that the painting was in good enough shape to travel, and that the trip had been approved and sanctioned by French officials, most importantly, President Charles de Gaulle. She stressed to him that this was the perfect expression of intermingling art with politics, and she had somehow constructed the ideal union of culture with diplomacy. So she saw the loan of the Mona Lisa, the masterpiece, as a source of pride for both herself and President Kennedy and the nation, a loan that would lift the image of America abroad and elevate to her the interest in American citizens in art at home. Now, in the world of John Walker, objects of art never had a role in the gritty, grimy world of politics. If through a miracle the painting arrived safely, it would be a defining moment for all Americans. But if the painting was damaged, it would cause a permanent rift with the French people,
yes.
And at the same time destroy one of humanity's great artifacts. Walker wanted no part of it. Well, she finally convinced him, and as I was writing the book, I often wondered why John Walker changed his mind. And we only learned after his death in his memoir. John Walker revealed the most poignant, sort of intimate thoughts about why he in fact changed his mind, because he was so against the idea. And he said in his memoir that during the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, watching Mrs. Kennedy bravely remain with her children at 1600 Pennsylvania and not being whisked away to an underground bunker, but bravely facing, really an enormous catastrophe, true nuclear peril that the world was facing at that moment between Cuba and the United States. And John Walker said he was so moved and touched by her bravery that he thought the least he could do for Mrs. Kennedy was oblige her in this request. However, it became such a daunting challenge for John Walker to take charge of the Mona Lisa for the 88 days it was in America that he actually had to be prescribed what he called Mona Lisa anxiety pills to get through the excruciating challenge of keeping the painting safe.
Well, Marnie, what do we know about President Kennedy's views on this? And did he have an opinion on whether this was a good idea?
Oh, yes. There's no question that he also saw this as an unmatched opportunity to burnish the American image. It was, again, a unique moment in American politics. Now we're used to 24-hour cable news and constant blasts from the internet on Twitter and social media. But this was the first time television and color television had been brought into the mix. And also, interestingly enough, the very first satellite images from the U.S. to Europe in color were, in fact, the night that the Mona Lisa was displayed for the American public. So it was a mix of politics, it was a mix of diplomacy, it was a mix of goodwill, and in his speech that night during the opening of the exhibition, he crafted a carefully worded message concluding his aims about what the meaning of this exhibition was for the American people and for politics.
So despite the controversy on both sides of the Atlantic, the Mona Lisa did set sail for America on the SS France on December 14th, 1962, and to be exhibited at both the National Gallery in Washington and the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. But I understand a number of intense safety precautions were deployed with very impressive security arrangements and even some threats along the way as to what might happen if any of these were violated. Fill us in on all of that.
Well, it really was a mission impossible, like out of a Tom Clancy novel, to get the painting safely here. And President Kennedy handpicked the Secret Service agent that he wanted to accompany the painting. It was his favorite Secret Service agent. His name was John Champion. He had great respect for the man. So John Champion, in his black overcoat with a machine gun under his armpit and another pistol strapped to his ankle, awaited the ship to arrive into New York Harbor. So imagine, the Mona Lisa is not going to travel by airplane. By now, of course, we have Air Force One.
Yes.
Airplane travel is common, but no, the French want the grandest manifestations that they can muster, and they send the painting across the Atlantic on the SS France. That was that giant $80 million superliner, and she was strapped in her own luxury suite, bolted to the floor in a specially designed traveling case that the lady from the Louvre, Madame Auers, that I mentioned, managed to put together. This case was incredible. It was climate controlled. It was buoyant, so the unthinkable happened, and the ship suddenly caught fire. The idea was that the crate would be thrown overboard, and she had the French flag painted on the outside of Mona Lisa's crate. So in case the unthinkable did happen, the French could scoop her up because she would be in international waters. Well, along with all of these precautions, sharpshooters, John Champion waiting for her in America, there was one more contingency placed on the Mona Lisa's exhibition, and that was the Louvre insisted that the Mona Lisa must be kept at the same temperature that she had breathed for centuries in her home at the Louvre, which was approximately 76 degrees. And it was really fun to read all the contracts and all the memos associated with the exhibition. And it says clearly, should the temperature deviate 2 degrees up or 2 degrees down, the painting would be seized by the French instantly and returned to the Louvre. So not only did John Walker have to keep the Mona Lisa safe from thrill seekers, criminals, terrorists, bad weather, he also had to keep the temperature constant at 76 degrees. And anyone who's stepped foot in the giant rotunda of the National Gallery, filled with its glorious marble walls and ceilings, knows that this is no small feat. So John Walker and his anxiety pills somehow managed to install the proper electronic equipment. It was called a hygrothermograph, which he hid in a little sort of potted plant under the display of the painting to constantly monitor the temperature. So the Mona Lisa was crossing the Atlantic for, really 5 days, and only in a story like this, a real storm of severe nature, of course, descended on the ship, and actual wire contact was lost with the ship for about 20 hours. It was sort of a frightening situation, panic on both sides, both from Paris and from Washington. But the ship made it through the storm and chugged its way all the way into New York Harbor.
Now, there were other passengers on this ship. It wasn't, the Mona Lisa wasn't on a private yacht of her own. Did the passengers know about this special cargo?
Absolutely not. And keep in mind, these are very expensive luxury suites on this ship, quite a elite group of passengers. And several passengers became alarmed when they saw curious activity surrounding what was Mona Lisa's suite. Armed guards, interesting movements. They knew something was afoot there. And keep in mind, this is, just after the Cuban Missile Crisis, at the height of the Cold War. And really, there was almost a panic aboard ship when the passengers demanded what was going on. Was there a secret nuclear weapon aboard the ship? Was there something else going on that they must know? And finally, after truly a panic aboard, the ship's captain had to reveal to the passengers that they were traveling with none other than the illustrious Mona Lisa. And soon panic turned into sort of a happy conga line. And the chef started creating Mona Lisa concoctions and special meals and desserts. And it was a great sort of party atmosphere that these passengers would never forget that they were traveling with the Mona Lisa. Now, there was one reporter who was invited to travel along with the ship. His name was Edward Folliard. Many of you might know his name. He had won the Pulitzer Prize. He had reported for the Washington Post, over several presidencies. He was a remarkable talent, truly one of the giants, I think, of journalism. And he, keep in mind now, this is 1962, December, as the Mona Lisa is coming to America. He is dispatching daily stories to the Washington Post, which he must send by Morse code. And sure enough, his articles were filled with color. They were exciting, they were enticing, and really he set off this Mona mania that soon descended on D.C. and New York City. And there were incredible cartoons of Edward Folliard and the Mona Lisa holding hands, walking down the gangplank, and his stories were printed almost daily on the front page of the Washington Post.
Well, after her 5-day boat ride across the tumultuous Atlantic and being celebrated by the passengers on the ship, Mona Lisa arrived safely in New York and was escorted by a motorcade and secure convoy from New York to Washington, D.C., unimpeded by traffic lights, I understand. And then it had a special installation at the National Gallery. Tell us about those preparations and that motorcade drive down from New York. And even though they had planned so carefully, I understand there was a rather rowdy crowd awaiting for her when she arrived in Washington.
It really was. Well, the painting arrives in New York Harbor. John Walker and the Secret Service agent John Champion are there to greet the Mona Lisa. They install her in a black, unmarked National Gallery van, drive her to Washington, where she is placed in an underground storage vault known by insiders as Vault X. And there she would stay until she was brought out and displayed. You know, it's so interesting. Poor John Walker, the only place he could display the Mona Lisa was inside the giant Rotunda Hall. So he created sort of a beautiful red velvet baffle backdrop to the painting, which museum officials called affectionately Mona's kimono. He did his best to light her under the bulletproof glass. He installed the hygrothermograph I mentioned to make sure the temperature was always at 76 degrees. But Mrs. Kennedy insisted that every head of every government branch, including every member of Congress, every senator, every cabinet secretary, every head of every major university, every publisher from all of the major newspapers, plus every member of her family and the Kennedy family, all to be present in this one night. So the guest list for the opening night ceremony mushroomed to over 2,000 people. And the photographs are really quite astounding of 2,000, really, of America's best and brightest, really America's government ruling class all assembled to witness the Mona Lisa's unveiling. And, poor John Walker, the microphone system malfunctioned, one problem after another. There was a problem with the elevator, problem after problem, as there always is. And really, what it turned out to be was more like a queen's coronation than the opening of an art exhibition. But in the end, the president delivered a beautiful speech, a rousing speech that was printed in newspapers around the world, that achieved exactly the President and First Lady's aim to burnish America's image both at home and abroad.
And what was the reaction of the American public? Did they respond?
Absolutely. Nearly 2 million people lined up to see the Mona Lisa in both Washington, D.C. and New York City. They waited for hours in long, snaking lines, sometimes 5 abreast. The pictures show the lines, blocks and blocks long, eager to get inside the National Gallery. And there's no question that the exhibition triggered something new in the American consciousness. It triggered sort of a renewed appreciation for culture and the fine arts. We had just come off of the Eisenhower years, kind of known for the post-war gray, cold years. And here we were suddenly replaced with vibrant cultural and artistic interests brought to national attention by the youthful and exuberant Kennedy family. And Mrs. Kennedy was very much the prime mover in sort of this new feeling and sensibility. For many, Stuart, of the visitors who came to the National Gallery to see the Mona Lisa, it was the very first time they had ever set foot in a museum.
Mm.
They brought their children, they brought their grandchildren, grandmothers in wheelchairs. It was just a fantastic force of humanity showing up to see this painting by Leonardo da Vinci, one of civilization's most famous and most renowned artifacts. People from every facet of life, and many of the residents from Washington's poorer neighborhoods also came out to see the Mona Lisa. Teachers brought their children from their classrooms. There's just great photographs of, busloads of children enjoying their chance to see such a treat. So today we know the Blockbuster Museum exhibition. We're familiar with the King Tut exhibition and others. But this was the first time Americans had lined up literally for hours to see a piece of art. And I think it was a sensibility that stayed with us from that time on.
Well, you've shared with us this dramatic story and moment in American history and involving such larger-than-life characters with John Kennedy and Jacqueline Kennedy and Andre Malraux and Charles de Gaulle and John Walker. And yet this story, as compelling as it is and as meaningful as it was at the time, has been largely forgotten. Why do you think that is?
It really is sad. Think of the time now. The exhibition was January 8th, 1963. And of course, the tragedy of the assassination was just November of that year. The record does demonstrate that the exhibition, it really was considered the most important cultural event of the administration. And it was featured, on the front pages of newspapers around the world, literally hundreds of magazine covers globally, not just in America, but truly on a global basis. 2 million people participated in the event, huge domestic impact and sweeping reach. And as I mentioned, Mona Lisa's debut was also broadcast in the first early days of color television. But there's no question it was completely forgotten in the wake and sorrow that the world, and especially America, felt following the president's horrible death on November 22, 1963. And the Mona mania and the Mona Lisa fever that had gripped the nation was completely forgotten.
Well, it's for certain that the world remains intrigued by and fascinated by these two remarkable women, one on a piece of art, the Mona Lisa, and one iconic in American history, First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy. As an author, and all the research that you've done and looking into the lives of these two iconic women, what do you think they have in common?
Well, you're so right, Stuart. Mona Lisa, imagine, was the first lady of the world. And certainly the first lady among paintings. But Jacqueline Kennedy was first lady of the nation. They shared a level of fame, a level of devotion, and this is worthy. This is Leonardo da Vinci's great masterpiece. Jacqueline Kennedy certainly broke through the boundaries of the traditional First Lady role. One of the most interesting things I learned writing this book was how keenly both the President and the First Lady insisted on the burnishment of the arts, so much so that they wanted a cabinet-level arts czar, much like we see in European countries. For instance, in France, with Minister Malraux, there's a cabinet-level official devoted to the arts. And I learned this for the first time myself writing this book, that Mrs. Kennedy had actually initiated, with President Kennedy, the appointment of an arts czar, a talented man named August Heckscher. Many of your listeners might know him. He was the former arts commissioner of New York City. He wrote this great book called The Public Happiness. And he had been named in 1961 by President Kennedy to serve as a special consultant on the arts. And he had begun to formalize the administration's commitment to the role of arts in American life. And Heckscher, along with Mrs. Kennedy, had this idea that federal support for the arts, was an antidote to the industrial society, to an awakening of American humanity and consciousness. And it was Jackie who wanted Heckscher, in fact, to be appointed in this arts czar role. And sadly, much of the paperwork that was just about ready to be released to further this goal had been produced in late October, just before the assassination. So again, all of that was lost in the wake of this unthinkable tragedy that impacted all of us.
Well, believe it or not, there are many more dramatic twists and turns to this powerful story, colorful characters that are depicted in the pages of this wonderful book, but we don't want to completely spoil it for our readers. So we'll pause here and just reflect on this captivating episode in American history that showed Mrs. Kennedy's appreciation for arts and her desire to share these important works with the American people. And, it's the same brilliance that also inspired Mrs. Kennedy to found the White House Historical Association, which I believe is the living legacy to her commitment to historic preservation, a legacy that is alive and well and influencing the White House today. So it's important for us to tell this story, and it's part of the other stories that we tell about the White House and its history. So thank you, Marnie, for being with us today. And for our listeners, you can order the book, Mona Lisa and Camelot, on our website, whitehousehistory.org. And Marnie, I look forward to sharing this story with you many times throughout the coming months.
Thank you, Stuart. It's a privilege to join you.
Thank you. Take care.
You've been listening to the 1600 Sessions. This podcast is presented by the White House Historical Association and produced by Long Story Short Media. You can subscribe or download new episodes at the1600sessions.org. And you can help others find this podcast by rating and reviewing us on iTunes. Thanks again to Margaret Leslie Davis. And thank you to the U.S. Marine Band Library, which provided the music for this podcast.